Remember last week? That collective sigh of relief among allies that Donald Trump had A, shown up at the NATO summit, and B, agreed to a sidebar meeting with his Ukrainian counterpart, after which the U.S. president gushed that Volodymyr Zelensky, quote, couldn't have been nicer. Quite the contrast with that February White House ambush, as some call it, on live television that spooked Europeans. But that was last week. Now comes a double whammy, a pause in U.S. arms shipments to Ukraine, officially to replenish stockpiles, says the Pentagon. But the freeze includes weapons and ammo already in neighboring Poland. Add to that news that Washington's lifting of sanctions of Syria also includes Russian oligarchs and entities also implicated in the invasion of Ukraine. We'll ask how many and about the ways Russia keeps exporting oil and cashing checks from abroad as Ukraine figures out how to resist without Washington's help. We'll also ask about Europe's efforts. On that score, what to make of Tuesday's first phone call between French President Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin since Russia's first full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Similar tone, according to the Kremlin readout, to that Putin has just had with Donald Trump. Today in the France 24 debate, is it too late to win over Trump? And joining us from the Ukrainian city of Odessa, Hannah Shelest, director of the security programs at Ukraine Prism. Thank you for joining us on a day when your city's been the target of a Russian strike, at least 2 killed. Hope you and yours are well.
Thanks for the invitation. It was really very close, 500 meters from me and 50 meters from my father's office. So there were 2 attacks, de facto against the city, against the absolutely civilian infrastructure today.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks as well to former French ambassador to Russia, Claude Blanche-Maison. Your memoir, Fragments of an Adventurous Journey, is the title in French, published by Temporis. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
He's European correspondent for Newsmax. In a previous life, he hung his hat in Moscow for the Wall Street Journal. Craig Kapidas is author of Bear Hunting with the Politburo. How are you?
Okay.
And from Nottingham, England, Canadian academic Tyler Kustra, who researches the impact of sanctions. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
By the way, a reminder, if you're on the go, you can listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. Yeah, it's not just Odessa. Dateline Poltava, that's in central Ukraine, 2 killed, 47 wounded in broad daylight. A Russian attack that targeted a military recruitment center. Air defense, exactly what's needed and what's being paused on the part of Washington. And after summoning Washington's envoy in Kyiv for clarification, Vladimir Zelensky in Denmark for the start of its 6-month EU presidency, there on the sidelines, he announced a deal to build drones with a U.S. company. Enough to win back Washington? Catherine Viette has more.
A show of European support for Ukraine after the U.S. announced it would halt some key arms shipments to Kyiv. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Denmark as the country assumes the rotating presidency of the EU Council to cement ties with the bloc and keep Kyiv's goal of joining the EU alive.
Now, when there are doubts about continued U.S. support for Europe, it's even more important to strengthen our cooperation and coordination through the EU, NATO, and also in our direct relations, both with each other in Europe and with the United States.
The talks overshadowed, though, by that abrupt halt in weapons deliveries by the U.S., as EU officials say the news from Washington is a clear message that Europe must step up.
But of course, if U.S. decides not to provide Ukraine with what is needed, it would be a serious setback for Ukraine and for Europe and for NATO. Because as I guess both of us have said already, the war in Ukraine has never only been about Ukraine. This is a war about the future of Europe.
While in Denmark, Zelensky did sign an agreement with American firm Swiftbeat to expand domestic drone production. However, analysts say all this uncertainty has European partners questioning Washington's commitment.
If any US administration now comes and says, we'll change this agreement, we're cancelling this agreement, we're not going to fulfill our contractual obligations, then the same question comes up as this winter, when we already had a weapons halt, remember. Is the USA a reliable partner?
Ukraine relies on the American-made Patriot system to shoot down ballistic missiles, and any delay in receiving the necessary rockets would be a big blow to the country's air defenses. Zelensky says he expects to speak with U.S. President Donald Trump on Friday to discuss the issues surrounding the arms deliveries.
Claude Blanche-Maison, is this for Europeans? You heard the Danish Prime Minister in that clip saying the future of Europe's at stake here.
Yes.
Is this pause in weapons shipments a surprise that you can put on par with, again, that February meeting at the Oval Office between Zelensky and
Well,
Trump?
I think she wanted to make the point at the beginning of this semester chairmanship of the Denmark for the European Council. And the Prime Minister of Denmark has become a strong supporter of Ukraine since she took office. She was not like that before. So she realized that it was really the future of Nordic part of Europe and of Europe as a whole, which was going to be at stake now. And also, as you know, the Nordic country has an organization called Nordec, and they have also many consultations between themselves. And I think she was convinced, she has been convinced
again,
by the Swedes and by the Norwegians.
I go back to this timeline. Last week, the NATO summit.
Yes.
And everybody's like, oh, well, maybe Trump's on board. Did you feel like that last week?
I think the communique of this summit of NATO was a good communique, very, compact, only one paragraph or so. Last year it was maybe 45 paragraphs, but it says that what was at stake was the security of Europe and of Euro-Atlantic community, which is good, and said also that Ukraine was of paramount importance for Europe. But that's all, no more commitments. And of course, this communique has been prepared by diplomats before the meeting so that Trump could not make any declaration which would have been out of the scope. But then yesterday he decided to stop the nuclear military help to Ukraine. So it's still going on the same line. And now when we are discussing around this table, he is on the phone with Putin. And on the phone with Putin, he's probably making some new concession again. He has made so many concessions to Putin since he took office in January last without any return from the Russian.
All right, and we'll get back to the art of having a phone conversation with the Russian president in a moment. But Hannah Shalest, let me ask you, watching that report we just aired, is it the right strategy of Volodymyr Zelensky to be hyping up this joint production of drones with the United States? Can that change any minds in Washington?
I would not say that it is changing or not changing the minds, because it is a lot of the diplomatic work happening these days in Washington and around. And we know that tomorrow we are expecting the direct conversation between the president of Ukraine and the president of the United States. So that can be something that is changing the mind of the US president, especially as with these calls of the military support. It's not the announcement of the White House. It was the decision of some people at the, even not at the top level of the Pentagon. So let's see. We're still waiting. Everything can change in 24 hours. But at the same time, Ukraine has been doing it for the last 2 years. We've been calling for the joint production because we have expertise, we have technology, we need additional money, or we would like some other technologies that companies can have. That's how we have already joint production with the Germans, with Turks, with British, French company opened the office not so long ago in Kiev. Now it is the Danish and the Americans. So that is parallel process. It is ongoing because we need anyway much more than what the US can give us, first of all. And the second is, in some types like drones, we are much better than any of the US companies right now, because we have a possibility of testing and upgrading these drones daily. We just need a proper investment, financing, and all other procedures. What we depends on the US, it is these strategic missiles for air defense, like the Patriots, but not only them, the air-to-air missiles, for example. That's what you need against the Russian ballistic missiles. That's what we are not producing yet to secure and to make our country safe.
But we see that you've been the victim, again, in Odessa, where you are, of airstrikes just this Thursday in that central city of Poltava. But neither side controls the skies. Case in point, the killing of Major General Mikhail Gudkov, deputy head of the Russian Navy and a former commander of a Marine brigade. He was killed in a Ukrainian missile attack on a command post in Russia's Kursk region. Again, Hannah Shelest, what's the frame of mind where you are? That this is, because neither side controls the skies, this is a long slog and it's going to continue? Or is there a feeling that we're at some kind of turning point?
No, unfortunately, we don't have a turning point. We had this feeling when the negotiations in Istanbul been finally initiated. But the first bad sign was when Mr. Putin decided not to come to Istanbul and de facto send a very low-level person with a very particular reputation as the person who wrote the fake history books for the Russian schools. So now you see how many 100 days after this, Russians didn't present properly their conditions for the negotiations. They are not calling for the next round of negotiations to which Ukraine was ready. And even today, we just had the first conversation between Putin and Trump. So to have any type of the ceasefire, or at least the easing of the situation, 2, 3, 4 sides need to sit and to talk. And what we see from the Russian side, that they are announcing the readiness for the negotiations, but not coming to them. Why? Because that allows them to keep Americans from imposing the new sanctions against them. So their interest is not preventing the further activities in Ukraine or even against their territory, but just not to have the introduction of the additional, more severe sanctions from Washington.
All right, let's give our public the sort of a flavor of the message being put out by the Kremlin. It's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, ahead of that Putin-Trump phone call earlier, talking about the weapons freeze.
We are watching attentively. The fewer missiles that are shipped to Ukraine, the closer the end of the special military operation is. The industries are apparently struggling to make the necessary number of missiles, especially as there have been a lot of shipments to Israel and Ukraine. So there are certain problems in that regard.
So Dmitry Peskov, Greg Kapitas, taking at face value that the Pentagon has trouble with its stockpiles and saying, look, it's a sign of U.S. weakness, effectively.
Dmitry Peskov, you mean the gentleman whose children frolic freely here in the West and take advantage of our largesse? Look, there's some bottom lines here that need to be considered. First of all, the Russians don't give a damn about casualties. They never have, going back to Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Stalin, Lenin, you name it. Don't even mention casualties. The Russians have more people than the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are heroic, but they're going to be crushed by the Russians, as they were when Catherine the Great took over Crimea back in her day, unless the Americans come in with serious air power and serious weapons. Europe cannot do this on its own. Anyone who thinks they can is whistling past the graveyard.
So when Ambassador Blanche Maison says that he worries that whenever there's a phone call between Trump and Putin, there are concessions made by the U.S. president?
Look, diplomats, bless your heart, sir, cling to this fantasy that Russia is our friend or can be our friend or can be our partner. They cannot. Putin is an enemy. He has been since the day he started in 2000. It was clear at the Munich conference in 2004. And anyone who reads the Russian papers, or like our guest down there in Odessa, has to live through this crap on a daily basis. All you need to do, if you want to know what Putin's up to, it's real simple, Francois. Go to the cathedral that Putin built in Moscow back in 2020, which started in 2015. It's the Cathedral of War, an Orthodox cathedral. And in this cathedral are murals celebrating all of Russia's great victories going back to Ivan the Terrible. And you know what they have in this cathedral, Francois? There's about 15 or 20 murals that haven't been painted yet to put up Russia's future victories. The Russians want back the Warsaw Pact nations. They'd love to come back to Paris like they did after the Napoleonic War. And anyone who doesn't believe that, anyone who doesn't realize that, is just leaving the Ukrainians there on their own. Bottom line.
So, Tyler Kustra, how do you handle a telephone call with the Russian president?
I mean, I don't really think you can think that Vladimir Putin is a legitimate, trustworthy partner in any of this. You can't take any of his promises seriously. And I don't particularly see the point in trying to negotiate with a man who doesn't want to negotiate, and who, if he does sign a piece of paper, it loses value because anything that he signs isn't worth the paper that it's written on. The way to do this is to make sure the Ukrainians are able to defend themselves, to provide them with the munitions they need to keep their country safe, and to check the Russian aggression at the Ukrainian border so that this doesn't spill out. Because as the previous guest just said, Putin isn't going to stop at Kyiv. He wants to take Warsaw. I don't know what he's going to do after that. Does he want to go into Germany? And if you have a situation like that, that's exactly how the United States gets dragged back into another war in Europe. Trump trying to say the US wants to stay out of this, in fact, makes it more likely the US is going to be dragged back into this. What the White House needs to do is provide the Ukrainians with the munitions they need to defend Ukraine, and thereby also defend the rest of the free world.
All right, so there's this weapons freeze reportedly catching some inside the Pentagon off guard. The last time there was a weapons freeze, Russia didn't overrun Ukrainian positions, but their incremental gains did increase. According to the Wall Street Journal, this time around, it includes weapons that are already in neighboring Poland to the west. National Public Radio's Pentagon correspondent took inventory of what just is over the Ukrainian border. There's the list. It's significant, but it's not huge. But still, what message does that send, Tyler Kustra, when the weapons that are already in Poland are not being shipped over?
It sends a message that whoever talked to Trump last really isn't there for the Ukrainians as they should be. It sends a message not only when you see the Patriots not being delivered, and you could try to make an argument, well, the US has a lot of demand for Patriots amongst the various places that it needs to be, but also when you see the lack of delivery of howitzer rounds, that's not something that's in demand anywhere else. This is a message, unfortunately, to the Ukrainians by people in Washington that they don't want to continue to help the Ukrainians. I think it's very sad. I think what we need is Trump changes his mind based on the last person he talked to. So the people who are in favor of helping Ukraine need to make sure they get into the White House and buttonhole Trump and tell him this is in fact, tell Trump that defending Ukraine is the right thing to do. He flaps in the wind on this, and we just need to get someone in there to say, look, hey, this is the wrong thing to do.
Claude Blanche-Maison, does Trump change his mind every other day, or is he consistent?
I don't think he's changed his mind very easily, because he can change his mind on the form, but on the ground subject, he is always going the same way, and he wants to get out this war and leave it to Europe. He doesn't care about this. In fact, he doesn't care about Europe. After all, apparently he has lifted some sanctions, which were at the Gazprom company, and the Gazprom now can finance quite freely this nuclear plant, civilian nuclear plant in Hungary. It was prohibited by sanctions. These sanctions has been lifted. Apparently by chance, but not by chance, in fact, because it's introducing something inside Europe, which is, of course, to arm the cohesion of Europe, because, of course, the weak state within Europe is Mr. Orban, Hungary. And this sanction has been lifted on purpose to allow Gazprom to finance this plant, which is a nuclear plant, civilian nuclear plant, in Hungary, which is a proof of what Mr. Trump is doing. He wants to do business with everybody, with the Russian, probably also with Ukrainian. But if the price to do that is to drop Ukrainian from a political and military point of view, he will do that. And that's, I mean, but it will not be so easy, because the Ukrainian army today is probably the best army in Europe, because they have been fighting for 3 years, and they have been inventing new armaments, including those naval drones, and now they are apparently in control of the Black Sea. I mean, the Russian cannot move in the Black Sea anymore. So the Ukrainian will continue to fight. It will last for a long time, as long as Europe can support them and can probably, of course, make joint venture on armaments with them. But I don't know for how much time. I'm quite sure that Trump will not change his mind.
Ambassador Blanche-Maison makes an outstanding point. Wanting to do business. Let's drill down into that a bit. When we here at this table say wanting to do business, we think, well, that business is going to be conducted with the public. For example, with the French people or the American people. That's not how it works in Russia. It's the security of the regime, not the security of the public, that Putin and every Russian leader has been concerned with first and foremost throughout history. These people who Putin is doing business with and Trump is doing business with.
So, for instance, when the Russian media outlet, opposition media outlet Meduza, reports on rolling internet outages in a lot of Russian cities that are a real problem for ordinary citizens, that the Kremlin doesn't care.
Could care less about it, because they can go in and kill all those people, as they have in the past. We tend to look towards the future as we sit around here. Diplomats, historians, we look at the future. I have always looked at Russia as a correspondent through the lens of the past. Putin is not KGB, he's Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, which created the KGB and the Cheka. These are vile, vile, evil people, and they from day one have operated with people who are known as quartermasters, who are their people here in the West who put the money together to support the regime. The business that the ambassador speaks of has nothing to do with the people of Russia, but for the Kremlin ration. Those people who are surrounding Putin, it has nothing to do with the society at large.
All right, and the ambassador mentioning their sanctions, as Ukrainian media report on the collateral effect of the U.S. lifting Syria sanctions earlier in the week. It's benefiting oligarchs, banks, and arms companies in Russia. One instance confirmed is the U.S. Treasury lifting sanctions on 3 Russian cargo ships, the Monte Bianco, the Monte Rosa, and the San Damian. Lloyd's, the insurance company's news website, says that in December, the vessels were targeted by the EU for their role in the transport of stolen Ukrainian grain. That loosening of sanctions, Hannah Shelest, over in Odessa, you know a lot about it.
Yeah, surely. The question is that we always are talking how effective or not effective the sanctions. Should we introduce more or not? The biggest problem always was not the introduction of the new sanctions, but the proper fulfillment and execution of already existing sanctions. And Russia, let's be honest, been quite good. They learned a lot from Iran, for example, but not only from them. Now Iran is learning from the Russian experience how to bypass sanctions. How many of the new offshore zones, so the gray schemes for the trade appears, how many countries, small island countries who helped the Russian Federation. And let's be honest, how many European countries, for example, the missile that today targeted Odessa port had the Bosch engine over there. That is the demonstration that when Russia really needs, they can get the goods they would like. It's expensive, it's difficult in terms of their economic development for the long term, but they are still capable of bypassing these sanctions. So with these new elements, that's quite an interesting. We still need the lawyers properly to explain it, because what I saw in some of the experts' reports, that it is the same type of the sanctions, but in the brackets it was written like Syria, Iran, Ukraine. Now Iran and Ukraine is still there. There are the same entities, legal entities, but Syria was taken off because all the sanctions against Syria was taken off. The question is now in implementation. So if the same company X is under the sanctions because of Ukraine and because of Iran, will the Syrian lifting be a loophole through which they would be able to get some access to the markets or not? Or it would be just a bureaucratic issue that this line disappeared from the sanctions list?
You mentioned, Hannah Shelest, a good point, which is the way to bypass these sanctions. Now, eyes tend to glaze over when headlines evoke, for instance, an 18th round of European sanctions against Russia. That was the case at the EU summit last week. Turns out there is a reason why you constantly need new sanctions in a long war. The New York Times published a story Wednesday effectively explaining that no new sanction is the same as no new sanctions, which is what's going on right now with the United States. They're not imposing new ones, is actually the same thing as lifting the sanctions. If I get this correct, Tyler Kustra, because you can just change the names of your companies?
In some cases, yes. If you are having individual level sanctions or company level sanctions, then you just find a workaround. You're not France 24 anymore, you're 24 France, okay? You could try to do it that way on the individual company level sanctions. However, on some of the legislation, and I don't want to get into it because everyone's eyes will glaze over, it does say just no trade with Russia for all of the following goods. So in some cases, you can't get around it like that. It becomes a very technical question of exactly how the sanctions were written. What I tend to find, though, is the reason the Europeans keep on wanting to do another round of sanctions is to show that they're doing something, and to come in and say, well, we're doing something on Ukraine, sanctions are something, so we get in the news again saying we're trying to help out. What we really need is actually not to just stop Russia's trade with Europe and America, because that's pretty de minimis right now, but to go in and stop the shadow fleet of Russian oil tankers going in and selling oil to India and to China.
Okay, so let me
and
ask
have
you,
the sanctions legislation that's stalled in the Senate to be brought to a vote.
So let me ask you then a concrete example. We just mentioned those 3 cargo ships that, again, the EU says that they stole Ukrainian grain. If the U.S. Treasury does maintain the lifting of sanctions on those 3 vessels, what can the European Union do? What can other NATO members do?
Unfortunately, not a terribly large amount for the EU, because basically the EU has run out of ammunition on sanctions on Russia, with the exception of a little bit of oil that is still coming in, but that's pretty de minimis. Unfortunately, someone in Washington decided to actually throw the Russians a bone and start to purposefully lift some sanctions on Russia. I think that's a bad idea. And I think, again, the pressure has to be brought to bear in Washington to say, look, this shouldn't be happening. We need to not only maintain the sanctions the US has on Russia, but also to possibly engage in third country sanctions. If you trade with Russia, then you don't get to trade with the US. And that could have a serious impact on Russia and put some more pressure on Putin.
And that's an outstanding point, Tyler. But as we all know, it's not going to happen. What our last two guests just talked about were the quartermasters, the people who broker these deals, who work in the shadows. That and those people at the CIA, and I'm sure in French intelligence, who monitor monetary movements, know where this cash is going. And if they don't, they can find out. And there's never been an attempt by the West to shut down this nexus of cash flow. But again, I think
never at all.
Not that I know of. I mean, it's like
isn't that a bit of a?
But again, the amount that gets through is sufficient for the Kremlin ration. You have to remember that. But on the other hand, here, Francois, what talking about the sanctions is like talking to someone who's in a coma. Okay, the real problem here is air defense for Ukraine to stop Russian aggression. Everything else is secondary. The sanctions have done zero to stop that. So you have to look at other means.
Okay, so you just heard Tyler Kustra, ambassador, saying that without the United States, it's hard to put the financial squeeze on Russia. Regarding air defense, we remember
It's true, but politically, I mean, while Trump has started to lift some sanctions, I mean, Europe has been reinforcing his own sanctions, which has some political meaning anyway, because nowadays this black fleet or shadow fleet, or I don't know how you could call it, they cannot come to a European port. I mean, they cannot come at all in a European port. They'll have to find another way. Of course, there are many other ways, but still, I mean, they cannot land in any European port. And then again, to reinforce those sanctions, I think the European Commission is going to turn around the Hungary possible veto next time, because there have been many packages of sanctions, and the next sanctions Orban said he will not accept it. Okay, but I mean, many sanctions are of a commercial nature, so they could be converted in commercial measure, and commercial measure
you don't need unanimity. Yeah,
majority.
My argument is it doesn't matter.
And up to now, we managed to send Orban out of the room during the vote, but and especially the Bundeskanzler was very good at that. But if he's still there and he tried to put a veto, okay, we turn it in commercial.
But getting back to the point made by Tyler Kustra, which is that without the United States, this is going to have a limited effect. So,
of course,
if you're French, what do? Do you send your ambassador to, say, China or India and convince them to stop buying Russian discounted oil?
We talk to Indians. We talk a lot to Indians. You know, we have very good relationship.
Is it working
with India? Well, they don't want to be seen as collaborating to this aggression. They don't want
need
to be
the oil
seen,
and it's cheap.
They say, you know, we don't control our own business. I mean, they play a game, of course. So we talk of that to them, and with the Chinese too. And with the Chinese, we have other subjects to discuss. With the Indian also. With the Chinese, of course, we discuss on non-proliferation, which is another matter, Iran. And we more or less agree on what to do on this issue. So therefore, we can also make our point on not accepting any measure which allow Russian to go around the European sanction if there is no more. In some time, there is no more American sanctions.
All right. It's been a week, by the way, for phone calls. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin today. And for the first time since early 2022, the same Putin speaking on the phone with Emmanuel Macron. Yeah, these are images from just before that bid to take Kyiv when, during COVID, Macron was told to sit at a long table. He didn't want to take a COVID test at the Kremlin. That's why he did it. The pair spoke on the phone Wednesday. The Kremlin's readout, it was Macron who initiated the call. According to both, there was a measure of conversion when it came to Iran and the Middle East. But as far as Ukraine goes,
the issue of the ceasefire was raised much less than the issue of Iran, I would say. We see Vladimir Putin continuing his unprecedented attacks, including on civilian targets. Although the question of a ceasefire has been raised, Vladimir Putin is insisting on the same conditions, which are not currently being met.
Hannah Celeste, your thoughts on phone calls?
I mean, if these phone calls can lead at least to something, why not? Ukrainians are not prohibiting anybody to speak with the Russian side. And even if you remember the Istanbul, everybody were so disappointed. That was the extremely bad negotiations. But what we received 1,000 of the Ukrainian soldiers who've been wounded, heavily wounded, and captured for 3 years in the Russian prisons back to Ukraine. So even if we can have some small results, that's already good. The question is that these conversations with Putin are also very good for the European leaders in terms of losing illusions about the Russian leadership. Each time they are calling to him, asking for some ceasefire or the human rights or values, anything what is normal for the human being. And what they received as the answer, no, we haven't reached our goals. So they are not speaking about peace or anything else. They're just speaking about the goals of their special military operation, meaning just to conquer Ukraine and for Ukraine to stop existing as
Hannah, let me ask you on that point. Let me ask you on that point. I'm just going to quote you from the readout, the Kremlin's readout of that call with Emmanuel Macron, saying that any peace deal should be comprehensive and long-term, provide for the elimination of the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, calls it a crisis, root causes, and to be based on new territorial realities. What is Moscow saying?
The root cause of the Ukrainian crisis is the existing of Ukraine as an independent state, because we know that the collapse of the Soviet Union are named by Mr. Putin as the biggest tragedy of the 20th century. And so you cannot solve this problem, unfortunately. But when you speak about the territorial, that's quite an interesting. He always said this phrase, and he insisted on the old occupied part of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, Crimea, and the newly occupied parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia region. But for approximately 6 months, we haven't heard these phrases. And guess when it happened? After Ukraine entered Kursk, because the new territorial reality means that Ukraine is now controlling the part of the Russian Federation that Russians were not able to defend. As for now, he returned back to these phrases because he considers that he almost won. There are heavy fightings happening at the border. That's when you hear Sumy region. But de facto, Ukraine is still controlling several villages at the Russian territory. So I believe that is more of this, bravade. That is more about demonstrating that I'm going to a bank, I would like everything, and now you propose me what you would like to give me. Because in all these conversations about peace or concessions, let's be honest, everybody is saying what Ukraine needs to do, what Europe needs to do, what the US, what NATO needs to do. Nobody is saying what Russia needs to concess under these conditions, what Russia will do. So Putin is perfectly playing with this, and he thinks that him taking off his armed forces from the territory of the sovereign state is enough. That is honestly something like the Middle Ages.
All right, so no end to the fighting in sight. Ukraine doing what it can, looking for workarounds, including the purchases of U.S. weapons through European allies. Denmark's prime minister, as we heard at the top, stating that the war in Ukraine involves more than just Ukraine, also involves more than just Europe. CNN reported earlier this week that Pyongyang is pottering a 30,000 troop deployment, with Europeans struggling to ramp up defense production. Its neighboring Poland doing business with the other Korea. It's just announced a second batch of 180 K2 tanks that are being purchased from Seoul. So that is an interesting development as well, Tyler Kustra, because if procurement is no longer coming from the United States, Europeans and Ukrainians, the EU members and Ukrainians are looking for alternatives. And by the way, the alternatives are cheaper.
Cheaper, possibly better at this. It isn't as if the US is the only weapons manufacturer for some weapons, but at the same time, it is for some very critical things the Ukrainians want and need, like Patriot missiles, etc. So we can get the rest of the world involved, and I'm certainly always happy when the Ukrainians get what they need to go and defend themselves against Russian aggression. But it's the rest of the world can't do this alone. Some particular things need to come from the United States and can only come from the United States.
And does that include what Craig Kapitas is calling for, and that is to say a no-fly zone over Ukraine?
I mean, I would love a no-fly zone over Ukraine. I think the Ukrainian civilians who were murdered yesterday by Russian drones would love a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
Can it be done without the United States?
Sorry?
Can it be done without the United States?
Can it be done without the United States? I think the Europeans could certainly try to do it without the United States. They would need the permission of the US to use particular aircraft that they purchased and would like to send over to the Ukrainians. They've got some of those permissions, but not all of them. And I would hope it could be done, but I'm not particularly expertise enough to say yes or no on a particular air power question.
Claude Blanche-Maison, do the Europeans have more cards in that department that they could play?
Well, I think we must realize that this conflict has been globalized. You mentioned North Korea. You mentioned also South Korea in a way. Of course, Iran has been playing a role. And this conflict has been globalized. I don't think we will come out of this conflict by a negotiation between Trump and Putin. Anyway, Putin is not interested by any kind of ceasefire, except if all his own conditions have been met. So, which would be, of course, a surrender of Ukraine, which is unbelievable and inconceivable. So there is no agreement possible in that format. So at a certain point of stage, the negotiation about the issue of this conflict should be extended. And I think it should be extended first to the permanent member of the Security Council, which was probably, I know that the UN is not very helpful up to now, but after all, the agency, the AEA, the International Agency for Atomic Energy, is very helpful. For instance, for the
for Iran.
No, I mean even in Ukraine.
For the Zaporizhzhia nuclear
For the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and has been proposing also to be active in other nuclear plant in Ukraine.
But that would just freeze the conflict.
But I mean, it's an agency of the UN. So if AEA is working in Ukraine, that means that UN is working in Ukraine. When also Mr. Zelensky is asking for the return of the children which have been stolen by Putin and which are now made small Russians in Russia, who could do that? I mean, it should be done also through a UN agency, of course, UNICEF or another one. But I mean, we have to wait. The war will continue. But at one stage, the conflict has been globalized, and the solution should include other players, including the, of course, the permanent member of the Security Council.
And there you have it, Francois. We've spent the past hour dancing around the question that we've been dancing around for the past 3 years. Is Ukraine's sovereignty expendable? Right now, at this moment, precise moment in time, it is.
For the United States?
Yeah. Ukraine is going to get crushed badly. As the ambassador says, it's going to take time because the Ukrainians are gut fighters. But without air cover, without air power, without the United States, Ukraine is expendable in the eyes of the United States right now. That's the reality. No one wants to admit it. I'm crying tears over it, but that's the reality.
Hannah Celeste, we're running short on time, but you were with us in the opening days of that bid to take Kyiv. At the time, the conventional thinking was that Vladimir Putin's push would be towards Odessa, a city he considers Russian. At this point in time, how's it looking where you are?
You know, we already heard about that Ukraine will fall in 3 days. And exactly because of this way of thinking and underestimating Ukraine, we're in the 3.5 years of war because other Europeans were too afraid to support Ukraine how it is needed.
Sur un théâtre d'opération, ça fait quand même un peu léger pour résoudre un problème de sécurité à l'est de l'Europe. Pour l'instant, il n'y a pas uniquement mettre des équipements.
Apologies, there seems to be an issue with the sound. Let's see if we can cross back to Hannah Celeste.
Sinon économique, et on ne sera pas prêt demain matin.
Apologies for that. The problem with a technical issue. That's the joys of live television. We'll try to...
They'll fight. They'll continue to fight. I'll tell you what she was going to say. They're going to keep fighting, and they should, because they're tough. But you can't fight without weapons and American help.
Hannah Celeste, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. No, I was going to say not only this, but two very important things. First is that for the last 3 years, Ukraine started to produce a lot of weapons. And with the support of many countries, now the situation would be changing if this country continue this support, and we see at least the Nordic who are ready to do it. And the second is that we need to be clear. If Ukraine is falling, are you sure that the next day it is not only Eastern European countries, but others as well? Russians are already conducting operation at the soil of the European states. They are already getting problems for the European states in the sea waters around the European states. So from Crimea, the missiles that are stationed there easily can reach Paris. So you can think that Ukraine is something to fall, but just think, would you like to be the next, or would you like to help Ukraine to win this war?
We'll have to leave it there for now. Hannah Celeste, so many thanks for joining us from Odessa. I want to thank Tyler Kuster for being with us from Nottingham. I want to thank as well Ambassador Claude Blanche-Maison, Craig Capitas. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.